secrets of abandoned buildings. Who hides within their walls? Abandoned buildings have always filled me with an inexplicable fear. There's something sinister about them. Empty window frames staring like hollow eyes, grey concrete walls saturated with silence. Maybe that's why I resisted my friend's idea of exploring a deserted construction site on the outskirts of our city for so long. But in the end, curiosity got the better of me. This construction site had stood abandoned for over 20 years. Locals said the building was initially intended to be a luxury hotel, but the project was abruptly halted and the construction company went bankrupt. The reasons remained unknown, which only fueled our interest. We gathered late in the evening. My companions were Lena, Dan, and Artem, my friends and self-proclaimed adventurers. Armed with flashlights and a camera for some amazing content, we headed to the site. Even as we approached, the unease began to creep in. The evening air was damp, and the massive, shadowy structure loomed over us like a forgotten monument. Concrete walls had partially collapsed, and the staircases looked like they might crumble at any moment. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" I asked Artem, who had proposed the expedition. "Of course," he smirked. "Imagine how many views we'll get if we find something cool." We climbed over the fence and entered. On the first floor, silence reigned, broken only by the echo of our footsteps. Dust-covered walls were smeared with graffiti, and the corners were cluttered with broken bricks and rusty tools. "Have you heard the legend?" Lena suddenly asked. "They say a worker disappeared here when the construction stopped. His body was never found." I chuckled nervously, trying to hide my discomfort, but Dan sarcastically replied, "Classic scary story for places like this. If the building swallowed him up, it's probably because of a collapse." We continued our exploration. At first, there was nothing unusual, just dust, broken windows, and debris. But the further we went, the heavier the atmosphere became. On the second floor, I noticed that the temperature had dropped sharply. The air became cold and damp, like in a basement. "Do you feel that?" I asked. "Just a draft." Artem waved dismissively, but there was no draft. There couldn't be. We entered one of the farthest rooms, a massive space with a high ceiling and an old metal crane in the center. Beneath it, rusty rebar was scattered across the floor. "Nothing interesting here," Dan said, heading for the exit. And that's when we heard it. At first, it was a faint rustling, as if something metallic was being dragged. Then, there was a dull thud, and we froze. The sound came from above us. "Is someone up there?" Lena asked in a hushed voice. We shone our flashlights at the ceiling but saw nothing. "Probably birds," Dan tried to joke, though his voice wavered. Deciding to investigate, we cautiously climbed to the third floor. The stairs creaked under our weight, and our flashlights illuminated only a small patch of the darkness ahead. The higher we climbed, the stronger the feeling grew that we were being watched. At the top, we were greeted by a long corridor lined with numerous doors. We began checking the rooms. Most were empty, but in one, I noticed something unusual. On the floor were drawn circles, and in the center lay a pile of burned papers. "Was someone performing rituals here?" Lena muttered, examining the marks. We studied the drawings closely. They resembled symbols, but their meaning was indecipherable. "Probably just local kids messing around," Artem suggested, though his tone betrayed his doubt. Then we heard it, a groan. We froze. It was a low, drawn-out sound that seemed to fill the entire floor. "It's just the wind," Dan whispered, but even he no longer believed his own words. We started heading back toward the stairs, but then we heard movement behind one of the doors. This time, it sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps. Artem decisively opened the door, and we all froze. The room was empty, but there were fresh footprints on the dusty floor, as if someone had just left. "This isn't funny anymore," Dan said. We quickly began descending, but when we reached the first floor, our path was blocked. A wooden plank we had stepped over earlier had fallen, barricading the exit. "Someone's messing with us," Lena hissed. At that moment, I noticed my flashlight flickering. We stood in almost complete darkness, hearing only our own ragged breathing. "Run!" Artem shouted. We bolted toward a side exit we had seen earlier, but as we passed one of the rooms, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A figure was standing in the shadows, a person. "Who's there?" I shouted, pointing my flashlight. But the figure was gone. We scrambled outside, leaping over the rubble. No one looked back until we were at a safe distance. When we got home, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Who or what had been there? Why did the sounds and shadows seem to follow us? The next day, we reviewed the footage from our camera, but nothing unusual appeared. Only in one room, where we had heard the footsteps, the camera captured a strange noise, a faint whisper. Since then, I haven't dared to enter abandoned buildings. Sometimes at night, I dream of that corridor and the shadowy figure. And every time I wake up, I feel as though it's still watching me. The jewelry box and the doll, tools of revenge. In a small town where everyone knew each other, Artem's life seemed perfect. He had a beautiful wife, Olga, a 5-year-old daughter, Lisa, and a cozy home. But not everyone saw this as fair. Victoria, Artem's ex-girlfriend, couldn't forget how he had left her after 3 years of a relationship. While Artem was building his family, Victoria lived in the shadow of her resentment. Her heart was torn apart by pain and anger, and one day, after seeing photos of his happy family on social media, she realized it was time to act. Victoria devised a cunning plan. She decided to strike at the thing Artem cherished most, his family. To avoid suspicion, she used 2 carefully chosen items. The first was an antique jewelry box. Victoria found it in an online shop and meticulously altered it, hiding toxic substances inside a secret compartment. When opened, the box would release a dangerous gas. The second was a beautiful porcelain doll. Victoria knew that Lisa would be delighted by such a toy. The doll itself was harmless, but it served as a distraction to ensure the jewelry box reached Olga. Victoria knew that Artem and his family often visited the local park. She went there on a sunny day when Lisa was playing on the playground, and Olga sat nearby with a book. Approaching Lisa, Victoria smiled warmly. "Hello there, sweetheart. You have such a lovely braid." "Thank you," the girl replied shyly. "I have something special for you and your mum," Victoria said, handing Lisa the porcelain doll and the jewelry box wrapped in a pretty ribbon. "This is for you," she said, pointing to the doll. "And this is for your mum. Tell her it's a gift from a kind lady." Lisa was thrilled with the doll and ran to her mother, clutching both gifts in her hands. "Mommy, look what I got." Olga looked up and saw the stranger disappearing into the crowd. Olga frowned as she examined the jewelry box. Gifts from strangers always made her uneasy, but this time something felt particularly off. "Lisa, who gave this to you?" she asked. "A lady," Lisa replied happily, hugging the doll. "She said the doll is for me, and the box is for you." Olga decided not to open the jewelry box immediately. She brought the gifts home, but couldn't shake her suspicion. At home, Olga told Artem about the strange encounter. He suggested taking the jewelry box to a specialist who dealt with antiques. The next day, Olga brought the box to a restorer's workshop. The expert immediately noticed something unusual. "There's a hidden compartment here," he said, carefully opening the false bottom. Inside was a container filled with an unknown substance. Alarmed, the restorer called the police. The police quickly traced the purchase of the jewelry box and doll back to Victoria. When they questioned her, she initially denied everything, but under pressure, she confessed to her plan. "He ruined my life," she said coldly. "I just wanted him to feel the same pain." She explained that the doll was intended to gain the child's trust, ensuring the jewelry box reached Olga. Thanks to Olga's vigilance, the tragedy was averted. The doll remained with Lisa, but her parents taught her never to accept gifts from strangers again. Victoria was sentenced to mandatory psychiatric treatment. The court determined that her actions stemmed from unresolved emotional issues, and she needed help. For Artem and his family, this chilling incident served as a reminder of how envy can manifest and the importance of staying alert. Though shaken, the family moved forward with gratitude, knowing how close they had come to disaster. Lisa, too young to understand the full scope of what had happened, remained blissfully unaware of the danger she had narrowly avoided. Return from the shadows. On the outskirts of a bustling European city stood a high-security prison known for its strict regime. Inside, Thomas Grayson had spent the last 6 years serving his sentence for armed robbery and attempted murder. But Thomas wasn't spending his time repenting. His thoughts were consumed by revenge. He blamed one man for his arrest, Mark Winston. Mark had witnessed the crime and provided key testimony that led to Thomas's conviction. From that moment, Thomas vowed to one day settle the score. One day, chaos erupted in the prison when a group of armed assailants attacked to free their accomplices. In the confusion, Thomas managed to escape. He knew the police would be on his trail soon, so he had to act quickly. Through an old contact, Thomas found Mark's address. Mark now lived with his wife, Karen, and their 7-year-old son, Henry, in a quiet suburban neighborhood. For several days, Thomas observed the family. He watched Mark walk, his son to school in the mornings, and Karen ride her bike to run errands. They seemed happy, and that only fueled his rage. "You took everything from me," Thomas muttered as he watched Mark hug his son by the front door. "Now, I'll take everything from you." Thomas devised a cunning plan. He constructed an explosive device hidden inside an ordinary package, intending for Mark to open it at home, killing everyone inside. Disguised as a deliveryman, Thomas approached the Winstons' house on a Saturday when the entire family was home. "Good afternoon, Mr. Winston. I have a package for you," he said with a fake smile. Mark was surprised but took the box. Thomas nodded and walked away, his heart racing with anticipation. When Mark returned to the living room with the package, Karen immediately felt uneasy. "Who's it from?" she asked. "I don't know. There are no labels," Mark replied, inspecting the box. Karen noticed that the box was unusually heavy for its size. She insisted that Mark not open it until they determined the sender. Mark agreed. They took the package to the police station, where experts discovered the explosive device hidden inside. When Thomas learned his plan had failed, he was furious. He decided to finish the job himself. That night, he headed to Mark's house, intending to ambush him near his car. But by then, the police were already guarding the house. Thomas was apprehended as he climbed over the fence. During his arrest, he shouted, "I just wanted justice." In court, Thomas confessed that he wouldn't have stopped until he destroyed Mark and his family. The ordeal brought Mark, Karen, and Henry even closer together. They learned to cherish every moment they had with each other. As for Thomas, he was sent back to prison under a stricter regime. Yet, despite his actions, he couldn't forget Mark's words in the courtroom. "Hatred has destroyed you, Thomas. I hope you'll one day find a way to break free from it." Those words stayed with him, and perhaps they might one day lead him to a better path. Missing hikers. What really happened? This story happened during the summer when my friends and I set out on a hiking trip through one of the most picturesque yet wild parts of our country. The forest trail through the mountains was famous for its breathtaking views, but few people knew about the dark secrets these places held. Our group consisted of 5 people: me, my best friend Alex, his sister Laura, and two of our acquaintances, Ethan and Sarah. We were experienced hikers, well prepared for a long journey. Each of us carried a backpack with supplies, tents, maps, and compasses. On the third day of our hike, we reached one of the key points on the trail, an old wooden cabin standing at the edge of the forest. Every hiker knew of it because it was the only structure within miles. The cabin looked abandoned, but inside there was a small fireplace and a few old benches. "Let's spend the night here," Alex suggested. The night was quiet, but an unsettling feeling hung in the air. When I woke up in the middle of the night, I saw Laura sitting by the window, staring into the forest. "Why aren't you sleeping?" I asked. She turned to me and whispered, "I think someone's out there." I looked out the window but saw nothing, just trees dimly lit by moonlight. "It's just the usual sounds of the forest," I tried to reassure her. But the next morning, it became clear that something was indeed wrong. As we packed to leave, Ethan noticed his compass was broken. The needle was spinning aimlessly. On top of that, Sarah couldn't find the map she'd had the night before. "That's weird," Alex muttered, checking his own compass. "Mine's not working either." Not giving it much thought, we decided to head north, navigating by the sun. But soon, the trail began to change. The path that should have led us to the next waypoint had vanished. We found ourselves surrounded by dense forest. "Maybe we took a wrong turn," Laura suggested, but I was certain we had followed the map. The deeper we ventured, the stranger things became. The forest grew eerily quiet. The birds stopped singing. The wind died down. It was an oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of our footsteps. Eventually, we stumbled upon an old overgrown path. It wasn't marked on the map, but with no other choice, we decided to follow it. After several hours, we emerged into a clearing with another wooden house at its center. This one looked even older than the cabin we'd stayed in the night before. "Where did this come from?" Sarah asked, puzzled. "It's probably another abandoned structure," Alex replied. We approached cautiously. The door was slightly ajar, and a musty, damp smell wafted from within. I didn't want to go inside, but Ethan decided to check it out. "No one's here," he called out after a moment. We stepped in. The floor was littered with scraps of old newspapers, and a dusty table stood in the corner. On one wall hung a faded, sepia-toned photograph. It showed 5 hikers dressed in mid-20th century clothing. "That's odd," Laura murmured. "Why would this photo still be here?" Before I could respond, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. "What the hell?" Alex yelled, rushing to the door. It wouldn't budge. We were trapped. And then I heard it. A faint whisper coming from above. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. We looked up. Something was moving in the attic. "It's probably an animal," Ethan suggested, though his voice betrayed his fear. Alex found a ladder leading up to the attic and suggested we investigate. None of us wanted to go, but we couldn't just sit there and wait. The attic was dark, but in the corner I saw something strange. A bundle wrapped in old cloth. Alex unwrapped it and found several handwritten books inside. They were diaries. We began to read. The first diary belonged to a man named Richard, who described his hike through this trail. He and his group had also stumbled upon the house, but as the entries progressed, they became more erratic. The forest changes, we see it, but it watches us. The paths disappear. At night, they come. We can't leave. On the final pages, the text was barely legible, but one entry stood out. They warned us, but we didn't listen. "This house is a trap." We froze, realizing the gravity of our situation. "This is just someone's creepy story," Alex tried to convince us, but I saw the fear in his eyes. When we descended to the first floor, the door was open. None of us could explain how, but we didn't waste time questioning. We ran. The forest felt alien again. The paths we'd seen earlier were gone. Every step brought the sensation of being watched. Hours later, we heard a sound. a scream so chilling it froze the blood in our veins. It wasn't human. "Run!" Alex shouted. We ran blindly, not looking back, until we finally burst out onto the forest's edge. Ahead of us was a rescue camp. The rescuers looked surprised to see us and told us they'd been searching for us for 3 days, though to us it felt like only hours had passed. When we described the house, they exchanged uneasy glances and said there was nothing there, but when we tried to retrace our steps, the path had disappeared. Since that day, I've never returned to that forest. Sometimes I dream of the old house and the whispers in the night. And every time I wake, I feel grateful that we made it out alive. The doll from the past. How I broke an ancient curse. This story began with a simple gift. My aunt, a collector of antiques, sent me a peculiar doll for my birthday. It was made of porcelain, with cracked skin, glassy eyes, and a vintage dress stained by time. "It's an antique," she said over the phone when I called to thank her. "They found it in an old house somewhere in Eastern Europe. I thought it would be perfect for your collection." I did have a soft spot for old things, and enjoyed collecting unique items. But this doll, there was something unsettling about it. Its eyes seemed to follow me wherever I went. I placed the doll on a shelf in my bedroom. That night, I woke up with a strange feeling of being watched. When I opened my eyes, I saw that the doll was no longer positioned as I had left it. Its face was turned directly toward me, even though I clearly remembered facing it the other way. It must have been my mistake, I thought, and went back to sleep. The next day, I adjusted the doll again, but when I returned home that evening, the doll was no longer on the shelf. I found it in the corner of the room, facing the wall. This was odd. I lived alone, and no one else could have moved it. That night, things got worse. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sound. It was a faint whisper, as though someone was mumbling to themselves from the corner of the room. "Who's there?" I called out, turning on the light. The room was empty, but the doll, it was on the floor, staring directly at me with its unblinking glass eyes. The next day, I called my aunt to ask if she knew anything about the doll. "Do you know anything unusual about this thing?" I asked. Her tone changed. "I didn't want to scare you, but there are rumors about it. They say it's cursed. Supposedly, the doll contains the soul of a little girl who died many years ago." I didn't believe in such tales, but something about the doll defied explanation. I decided to throw the doll away. I packed it into a box and drove it to the nearest dumpster. When I returned home, I felt a strange relief, but by nightfall, that feeling disappeared. Around midnight, I heard the same faint whispering. When I entered the living room, I froze. The doll was back on the shelf. Goosebumps ran down my arms. I knew I had thrown it out. The next day, I began researching the doll's origin. After hours of searching online, I found an old article. It spoke of a girl named Anna who had lived in the late 19th century. Her wealthy but strict parents locked her in her room when she became ill, refusing to let her out until she recovered. The girl died from her illness, and her favorite doll was found beside her body. Ever since, rumors persisted that her spirit had become trapped in the toy. The doll had passed from house to house, bringing strange events with it. People tried to get rid of it, but it always came back. That night, I realized I couldn't take it anymore. The doll sat on the shelf, its glassy eyes gleaming in the dim light of my nightstand lamp. I decided to burn it. I carried the doll outside, placed it in a metal bucket, and set it on fire. As the flames consumed it, a horrifying sound pierced the air. It was a scream, high-pitched and full of pain, as if someone was begging for help. The fire died out on its own, even though I had clearly seen the doll begin to burn. I returned inside, shaken to my core. The next day, I sought help from a woman who specialized in cleansing homes of evil spirits. She examined the doll and said, "This soul is trapped. It doesn't want to harm, but its suffering has made it dangerous." She performed a ritual during which I heard strange sounds, whispers and sobbing, faint but unmistakable. When the ritual ended, she assured me the spirit had been set free. After that, the whispers stopped, and the doll remained motionless. Several years have passed since then. I've stopped collecting antique items, especially those tied to mysterious stories. Sometimes I think about the little girl and hope her soul has finally found peace.